Hi everyone, I'm Alistair Ben and you're watching Expressive Photography. In this video I want to tackle the topic of which lenses should you buy for landscape photography. Now this is one of these great $100 million questions, and a lot of money is spent by various people looking for that answer. And what I'm hoping to give you here is my insight after being a professional photographer for nearly 20 years and shooting for decades. Which lenses have been the most important to me, why I made those choices, what they have done for my photography and my creativity, and perhaps what mistakes I could have avoided had I watched this video 20 years ago. If I dive into my Lightroom catalog, the metadata gives me an awful lot of information as to what are the lenses that I have been using most over my last 20 plus years of digital photography at least. And to my left here, I have three lenses that I have used more than any other. Now, of course, I swapped to the Fuji GFX system last year, so I've been using that for just over a year. So those lens choices have changed, and I'll go into the medium format system a little bit further on in this video. However, there are three lenses sat on my desk beside me that have been my three go-to lenses for the majority of my working career. I've been through three camera systems in that time. I started with Canon, so obviously I invested in Canon glass first. In 2007 I swapped to Nikon, and in 2023 moved from Nikon to Fuji. So obviously those lens choices have been evolving. And also I started as a bird photographer, and my very first lens was a 300 f4. Which is not usually everyone's first choice. So what I've done is I've gone into my Lightroom catalog here and I've looked at all the data, and what I have found is that there are three lenses sat on my desk here which have been my go-to lenses. So let's get straight into that. The first one here is a 12mm prime. This is a Laowa 12mm prime. Now, I'm not sponsored by Laowa in any way, so this is just my impartial view. This is the go-to wide-angled lens that I used predominantly in the late 2000s, sort of 2010 to 2020, before I switched out to Fuji. And the reason I went down that road was that the equivalent sort of 14 to 24, which was the kind of go-to wide-angled lens, certainly for Nikon shooters, it was big and bulky and it was very difficult to get filters for. This lens allowed me to use ND filters and polarizers and grads, and therefore it ticked a lot of boxes. Now, in next week's video, I'm actually going to cover the topic of the three most common mistakes that people make with wide-angled lenses. And the first piece of advice I would give anybody who's thinking of investing in a wide-angled lens is to realize, first and foremost, that they are incredibly difficult to use well. It is very easy to buy a wide-angled lens because a lot of the photography taken with them is incredibly impressive, but there is a downside to that. And I would say the majority of people who have wide-angled lenses are not getting the most out of them because they present extreme technical and processing challenges to get the most out of them. So if I was starting out to give someone some advice today, I would say probably don't start with a wide-angled lens, purely because they're one of the harder lenses to use. The next lens that's probably in most people's bags would be something along these lines, and this is a Nikon 24-70 f2.8. This is probably the most common focal length. It gives you something of the wide end, it gives you something at the zoom end, it allows you to zoom in a wee bit closer, but also gives you some of those wider angled perspectives. This kind of go-to middle zoom is a very popular choice, and a very large percentage of my images were taken with it. In fact, if I look at my notes, 45% of all my Nikon images were in fact taken with that lens. I think 24-70s are a really good focal range. F2.8 opens up possibilities for shooting at night. They're not horribly heavy. I think, I don't know, I'd be guessing that this is about 850, 900 grams maybe. So not terribly heavy. And I would say that as a first lens, it can be a very, very good choice. It's certainly, in terms of its weight to flexibility ratio, I think that is a really good way to go. We do talk about normal lenses, typically in a focal range of between kind of 45 to 50 millimeters. And what that really means is that the way you see the world in terms of the magnification and the visual relationships that present themselves to you are typically at that kind of 45 to 50 mil range. So it seems to make sense that if you want to portray reality in the way that you're seeing it, then using that kind of middle zoom is a good way to go. As soon as we start going wider, we are perverting or corrupting visual relationships between foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds. And again, once we start doing that, we end up in a situation where you need to develop your craft, you need to spend time understanding the implications and consequences of these compositional decisions. But a 24-70 pretty much has to be in every camera bag of every photographer. Incredibly versatile, and it gives you that kind of best of both worlds. The third lens, which I have actually used most in my Nikon days, and makes up 48% of every Nikon image that I shot, is this here. And this is my Nikon 80 to 400 mil lens. For those of you who are familiar with my Out of Darkness photo book, which is over my shoulder there, the vast majority of the photographs in that book were taken with that lens. The reason I love the longer focal length so much is that it's actually very, very easy to shoot with a long lens. You're eliminating things in abundance. You can zone in on small details. You can photograph things that are far away by zooming in on them, of course. And that wide focal length, I guess the other equivalent would be something like 100 to 400, that type of ballpark. Anything that's going to get you out there in terms of those longer focal lengths is an incredible way to simplify busy landscapes. I use long focal lengths to create shallow depth of field that creates an incredible sense of atmosphere in photography. I also use it to highlight things that catch my eye in big landscapes. The problem with using a wide-angled lens, and again I'll cover this in next week's video, is everything has to work with a wide angle. There's nowhere to hide. The landscape has to be harmonious and everything has to fit in the frame the way you want it to. There are lots of challenges with wide angled lenses. So in terms of ease of use, I think the longer lenses are easier to use, and as you get down to wider focal lengths, they actually get harder to use, particularly raising more processing issues. Now, I did say I was going to cover the medium format stuff. I know quite a few of you now are shooting with the GFXs, and the lens choice that I have would come as no surprise. At the wide end, I have this 20 mil to 35 mil f4. Medium format lenses are obviously kind of large, and to have this in an f2.8, it would be absolutely gigantic. So I am losing something in terms of the largest aperture from f2.8 to f4 in this case. And do I miss that? Yes, I do, to be perfectly honest with you. F2.8 is great in low light. I don't do an awful lot of astrophotography because this lens really doesn't allow much light into the camera. But the focal length of 20 to 35 millimeters on a medium format sensor is kind of 16 and a bit. So 16 millimeters on 35 mil equivalent. But I do use that lens quite a bit, but not as much as this, which is my 45 to 100. This is a great walk around lens for the GFX system and offers that similar field of view. It's kind of 35-ish up to about 80. So again, that kind of 24-70-ish, that kind of middle zoom. This is my normal lens on the GFX. And then finally, I use this guy, which is my 100 to 200 mil. And again, I use this the most out of my GFX lenses. So the same thing is happening, is that I am using the longer end more, the medium zoom bit next, and then the wide angled stuff is my least go-to thing. And I think your lens choices tell you something about who you are as a photographer, or who you may want to be as a photographer. Certainly in my earlier days, in the early 2000s, I was very much driven by a desire to be liked, to be popular, to build a business, to be recognized as a competent photographer. And my peers at that time were all using wide-angled lenses, people like Mark Adamus or Max Rive, and any number of people who've come up since then. And using wide-angled lenses was a way to create impressive images, majestic scenes. They all tend to be very expansive, very, very dramatic, very powerful in their drama and awe factor. But as I got a bit more mature with my own photography, and in particular after spending so much time in the Gobi between 17 and 19, I got into the longer lenses and found that I could make much more personal images, and images that were so much more me. And that was a hugely important thing for me. It's not unusual for photographers to have financial constraints. I know plenty of amateur photographers with $30,000 worth of kit because they can afford to buy that. I know plenty of people with lenses that just sit on the shelf and they never use them. I have been there, I have done that. I bought a lens because I thought it was going to be this whole new adventure that would change my creativity, and rarely is that the case. So if I was going to make a recommendation for people who were either starting out or wanted to simplify their lens choices, a medium zoom is always going to be a good bet. That 24 to 70 range is an absolute go-to, and I would always recommend it. But I would equally recommend something on the longer end, 80 to 400, 100 to 400, something like that, something that you can zoom right in on. You're not worried about having a big wide aperture. You're not going to be shooting particularly in low light. It's more about focal length. As with an awful lot of the expressive photography content here on YouTube, I'm sharing it because I wish I'd known these things 10, 15, 20 years ago. I would have saved myself a fortune. I would have saved myself an awful lot of headaches. I would have shared myself an awful lot of angst. And I do hope that you find this content to be of value. If so, please hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, hit the bell notification, tell your friends, tell your mother, do all of that type of stuff, because it is good for us to get our content in front of you on a more regular basis. Until next week, thank you very much for watching, and I wish you great light wherever you are. Bye for now.